I thought my wedding day would be perfect. My father had promised me something special, a gift that would make the day even more meaningful. But when he handed that gift to my brother instead, right there at the reception, I felt my heart shatter. What I discovered later about what that gift actually meant changed everything I thought I knew about my family. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The morning of my wedding started like a fairy tale. Sunlight streamed through the windows of the bridal suite at the Riverside Manor, casting everything in a golden glow. My bridesmaids, Sarah and Jessica, were buzzing around me, adjusting my veil and making sure every detail was perfect. The dress my mother had helped me choose 6 months earlier fit like a dream, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly calm. My name is Rebecca Chen, and after 2 years of planning, this day had finally arrived. I was marrying Marcus Williams, the man I'd fallen in love with during our senior year at Northwestern University. We'd been together for 5 years, and everything felt right about this moment. As I sat in front of the vanity mirror, watching Jessica apply the final touches to my makeup, my phone buzzed with a text from my father. "Can't wait to see you walk down that aisle, sweetheart. I have something very special for you today. Love, Dad." My heart swelled reading those words. Dad had been hinting for weeks about a surprise gift, something he said would make the wedding even more meaningful. He'd been unusually secretive about it, which wasn't like him at all. William Chen was typically an open book, the kind of father who couldn't keep Christmas presents hidden for more than a day without spoiling the surprise. The ceremony itself was everything I'd dreamed of. The outdoor pavilion overlooked Lake Michigan, with white roses and baby's breath adorning every surface. As Dad walked me down the aisle, his arms steady and reassuring, I caught his eye and saw tears threatening to spill over. He squeezed my hand gently before placing it in Marcus's, whispering, "Be happy, Rebecca. You deserve all the joy in the world." Marcus looked incredible in his navy suit, his dark eyes never leaving mine as we exchanged vows we'd written ourselves. When he slipped the ring onto my finger, his voice cracked slightly as he promised to love me through every season of life. I felt like the luckiest woman alive. The reception was held in the Manor's grand ballroom, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over the celebration. Our first dance was to "At Last" by Etta James, and as Marcus spun me around the dance floor, I caught glimpses of our families and friends watching with joy-filled faces. Mom was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, and even my usually stoic brother David was smiling broadly. It was during dinner that I expected Dad's surprise. He'd mentioned earlier that he planned to present the gift during the reception, maybe during the speeches. As the evening progressed, I kept glancing toward the head table where my parents sat, waiting for him to stand up or give me some signal. David had flown in from Seattle, where he worked as a software engineer for a tech startup. At 28, he was 3 years older than me, and we'd always had a complicated relationship. Growing up, it sometimes felt like our parents had different expectations for each of us. David was the academic achiever, the one who'd graduated summa cum laude from MIT, while I'd chosen a more creative path, working as a graphic designer for a marketing firm in Chicago. After the cake cutting, I was mingling with guests when I noticed Dad walking purposefully across the ballroom toward David, who was standing near the bar with some of Marcus's college friends. In Dad's hands was an elegant wooden box, about the size of a jewelry case but deeper, with intricate carvings along the edges. My breath caught in my throat. That had to be my gift. I excused myself from the conversation I was having with my college roommate and started making my way toward them, weaving through clusters of guests. But before I could reach them, I watched in stunned silence as Dad placed his hand on David's shoulder and presented him with the wooden box. "Son," I heard Dad say, his voice carrying despite the music and chatter, "I wanted to give this to you tonight. It belonged to your grandfather, and now it should be yours." David's eyes widened as he accepted the box, turning it over in his hands with obvious reverence. "Dad, are you sure? This seems like something—" "I'm absolutely sure," Dad interrupted, his voice firm but warm. "It's time." I stood frozen about 10 feet away, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Guests continued chatting and laughing around me, completely unaware that my world had just tilted off its axis. That was supposed to be my gift. Dad had texted me that morning about having something special for me, and now he was giving it to David instead. The wooden box looked antique, clearly valuable and meaningful. Whatever was inside had belonged to my paternal grandfather, Liu Chen, who had passed away when I was 12. I remembered him as a gentle man who told incredible stories about his youth in Taiwan and his journey to America in the 1960s. As I watched David carefully open the box, I felt tears burning behind my eyes. Inside appeared to be some kind of document or papers, along with what looked like an old photograph. David lifted out the photograph first, and even from a distance, I could see his expression change completely. His face went pale, and his hands began to tremble slightly. "Dad?" David's voice was barely above a whisper, but somehow I could still hear him. How long have you had this?" "Your grandfather gave it to me before he died," Dad replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "He made me promise to give it to you when the time was right. I wanted to march over there and demand to know what was happening, why my promised gift was being given to my brother instead. But something about the gravity of the moment, the way both Dad and David seemed almost overwhelmed by whatever was in that box, made me hesitate." Marcus appeared at my side, slipping his arm around my waist. "Everything okay, sweetheart? You look upset." I forced a smile, not wanting to create a scene at my own wedding reception. "I'm fine, just tired, I think." But I wasn't fine. I was confused, hurt, and increasingly angry. David had already received so much attention and praise throughout our lives. He'd gotten the full-ride scholarship to MIT, the high-paying job in Seattle, and now apparently, the meaningful family heirloom that I'd been expecting was mine. As the evening continued, I found it harder and harder to maintain my smile. Every time I looked at David, he seemed lost in thought, periodically glancing down at whatever he put back in that wooden box. Dad, meanwhile, kept looking between David and me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It seemed part relief, part anxiety, and something else I couldn't identify. The rest of the reception passed in a blur. We had our parent dances, threw the bouquet, and said goodbye to guests as they began to leave. But through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had happened, something that had nothing to do with my wedding, and everything to do with family secrets I didn't understand. As Marcus and I prepared to leave for our honeymoon suite at the hotel downtown, Dad pulled me aside near the coat check. "Rebecca, sweetheart, I hope you had the perfect day," he said, embracing me tightly. "It was beautiful, Dad," I replied, and it had been, despite my confusion about the gift situation. "But I thought you mentioned having something special for me?" His face flickered with something, an emotion I couldn't quite place. "We'll talk when you get back from your honeymoon, okay? There are some family matters that need to be discussed properly." Those words sent a chill down my spine, but before I could ask what he meant, Marcus was beside us, ready to whisk me away to start our new life together. Our honeymoon in Santorini was supposed to be the perfect escape, but I couldn't stop thinking about that wooden box. Marcus noticed my distraction on our third day as we sat on the terrace of our cliffside hotel, watching the sunset paint the Aegean Sea in brilliant oranges and purples. "You've been somewhere else since we left Chicago," he said gently, reaching across the small table to take my hand. "What's going on in that beautiful head of yours?" I told him about the gift situation, about Dad's cryptic comment regarding family matters that needed discussion. Marcus listened without judgment, the way he always did, but I could see the concern growing in his expression. "Maybe it wasn't actually meant for you," he suggested carefully. "Maybe your dad realized David needed whatever was in that box more than you did." His words stung, even though I knew he didn't mean them that way. But he specifically texted me that morning about having something special for me. Why would he do that and then give it to David instead? Marcus squeezed my hand. "I don't know, love, but knowing your father, there's probably a good reason. He adores you." The rest of our honeymoon passed peacefully, but that nagging feeling never fully left me. We explored the narrow streets of Oya, sampled local wines, and spent lazy afternoons on the black sand beaches. But part of me remained back in that ballroom, watching my brother receive what I'd believed was mine. When we returned to Chicago 2 weeks later, I threw myself into settling into our new apartment in Lincoln Park. Marcus had been living in a bachelor pad near his law firm, while I'd been sharing a place with Sarah in Wicker Park. Combining our lives and belongings provided a welcome distraction from the questions swirling in my mind. It was during this process that I discovered something unexpected. While unpacking a box of my childhood mementos, I found a manila envelope I'd forgotten about, tucked between old yearbooks and photo albums. Inside were documents from when I'd applied for my passport at 18, including my original birth certificate. I almost threw it in the filing cabinet without looking, but something made me pause. I'd never really examined my birth certificate closely before. As I unfolded the official document, my eyes scanned the familiar information. Rebecca Marie Chen, born August 15th at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago. Parents listed as William Chen and Linda Peterson Chen. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the section for father's place of birth, it didn't say Taiwan as I'd always believed. Instead, it clearly stated Seoul, South Korea. I stared at the document, reading that line over and over again. There had to be some mistake. Dad had always told us stories about growing up in Taiwan, about his family's traditions, about learning Mandarin from his parents. Our last name was Chen, unmistakably Chinese. How could his birthplace be listed as Seoul? A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and called David in Seattle. It was late afternoon, so he'd likely be finishing up his workday. "Hey, Rebecca," he answered on the third ring. "How was the honeymoon? You guys looked amazing in those photos Mom shared." "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I took a deep breath. "Do you have your birth certificate handy?" There was a long pause. "Why would you need to know that?" Can you check something for me? Look at where it lists Dad's place of birth." I heard rustling sounds, then the opening and closing of file cabinet drawers. "Hold on, I think I have it somewhere in my home office." The wait felt endless. Finally, David came back on the line, and his voice sounded different, strained. "Rebecca, where did you get the idea to check this?" "Just tell me what yours says." Another pause. "Seoul, South Korea. But that doesn't make sense. Dad's from Taiwan. His parents immigrated from mainland China originally. He's told us those stories 100 times. My heart was racing now. Mine says the same thing. "David, what was in that box Dad gave you at the wedding?" The silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. When David finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I think you need to come to Seattle, or I need to come back to Chicago. We can't discuss this over the phone." "David, you're scaring me. What was in the box?" "Documents, old photographs, and Rebecca." He paused, and I could hear him taking shaky breaths. "I don't think Dad is who we thought he was." Those words hit me like a physical blow. I sank onto the couch, clutching the birth certificate in my free hand. "What do you mean?" "The photographs in the box. They're not of the family Dad always described to us. There are pictures of him as a young man, but he's wearing what looks like a South Korean military uniform. And there are documents, Rebecca. Immigration papers, but not the ones he showed us before. These are different." My mind was reeling. "Are you saying Dad lied to us about his background?" "I'm saying I think our father has been living under a different identity for most of his adult life. And I think Grandpa Liu knew the truth, which is why he left these documents for me to find eventually." The room felt like it was spinning. Everything I thought I knew about my family, about my heritage, about the stories that had shaped my understanding of where I came from, suddenly felt like it was built on lies. "Why you?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Why did Grandpa leave this information for you and not me?" David's voice was heavy with an emotion I couldn't identify. "Rebecca, there's something else. Something I haven't told you yet, because I'm still trying to process it myself." "What?" "One of the documents in the box. It's an adoption certificate. From 1995. I felt the world tilt. "Whose adoption certificate?" "Mine, Rebecca. I was adopted when I was 3 years old. And according to these papers, my birth name wasn't David Chen. It was Kim Ji-hoon." The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the coffee table. I stared at it in shock. David's voice calling my name through the speaker sounding distant and muffled. My brother, the person I'd grown up with, competed with, sometimes resented for seeming to get more attention from our parents, wasn't actually my biological brother at all. Suddenly, so many things began to make sense in the worst possible way. The different expectations our parents had always seemed to have for each of us. The way Dad sometimes looked at David with an expression I'd never been able to interpret. The fact that David had always been more academically gifted, more driven in ways that seemed to come naturally to him but not to me. But it also raised even more disturbing questions. If David was adopted, and if the adoption had happened when he was 3, that meant he would have memories of his life before coming to our family. Why had no one ever talked about this? Why had David himself never mentioned remembering a different family, a different language, a different life? I picked up the phone with trembling hands. David was still there, saying my name with increasing urgency. "I'm here," I managed to whisper. "Rebecca, I'm booking a flight to Chicago tonight. We need to talk to Dad together. We need answers." "Do you remember?" I asked, the question burning in my throat. "Do you remember being Kim Ji-hoon? Do you remember your life before you were David?" The silence that followed was answer enough. David arrived at O'Hare Airport the next evening, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He carried a small duffel bag, and the wooden box that had started this whole nightmare. Marcus drove us to pick him up, sensing that this family crisis required his support, even if he didn't fully understand the scope of what we discovered. During the ride back to our apartment, David sat in the back seat clutching the box, staring out the window at the Chicago skyline he'd grown up with. "I've been having dreams," he said suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. "Ever since I opened this box, these fragments keep coming back. A woman singing to me in Korean. The smell of kimchi cooking. A small apartment with yellow wallpaper." I turned around from the passenger seat to look at him. "Those could be memories, David. Real memories from before." He nodded slowly. "I think they are, and I think that's why I've always felt different. Like there was this part of me that didn't quite fit with the Chen family story." Back at our apartment, David opened the wooden box on our dining room table. The contents looked innocuous enough at first glance, but knowing what they represented made everything feel charged with significance. There were several old photographs, some official-looking documents with Korean text, and what appeared to be letters written in someone's careful handwriting. "This photograph," David said, picking up a faded color image, "I think this is my birth mother." The woman in the picture was young, maybe early 20s, with kind eyes and David's same angular jawline. She was holding a toddler who unmistakably looked like David had as a child, though the boy's hair was darker and his clothes were different from anything I remembered seeing in our family albums. "The documents are mostly in Korean, but I found someone at work who could translate some of the key parts," David continued. "According to these papers, my birth name was Kim Ji-hoon, and I was placed for adoption through an agency in Seoul when I was 2.5 years old." I studied the immigration papers he showed me next. They detailed a process that looked nothing like the story Dad had always told us about coming to America as a young man to study engineering. "David, look at this date," I said, pointing to a stamp on one of the documents. "This shows Dad entering the United States in 1994. But he always told us he came here in the early 1980s, before he met Mom." "I know, and look at this." He handed me another document. "This is a name change certificate from 1994. Changing his name from Park Sung-ho to William Chen." The room fell silent except for the ticking of our wall clock. Our father wasn't just from a different country than he'd claimed. He had an entirely different identity, an entirely different name. William Chen was a constructed persona, and we had no idea who Park Sung-ho actually was, or why he'd needed to disappear. "There's something else," David said, his voice barely audible. "One of the letters in here. It's addressed to me, from my birth mother." My Korean friend at work translated it. He pulled out a piece of paper covered in neat Korean characters, with an English translation written in pencil underneath. "She wrote this when I was being placed for adoption," she says. David's voice cracked, and he had to stop for a moment. "She says she was too young to care for me properly, but that she hoped whoever adopted me would love me and give me opportunities she couldn't provide. And she asks that someday, when I'm old enough, someone would tell me that she never stopped loving me. I felt tears burning my eyes. The tragedy of it all was overwhelming. David had been separated from his birth mother as a toddler, brought to America by a man who was essentially living a lie, and raised believing he was part of a family whose entire origin story was fabricated. "Why would Dad do this?" I asked. "Why would he adopt you under false pretenses and then create this whole elaborate background story?" "I don't know," David replied, "but I think we're about to find out." I had called our parents' house that morning and asked if we could come over for dinner, claiming that David was visiting and we wanted to spend time together as a family. Mom had been delighted, immediately launching into plans for cooking David's favorite meal. Dad had seemed pleased but somehow unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting this visit. The drive to our childhood home in Evanston felt surreal. Every familiar landmark looked the same, but everything felt different knowing what we now knew. The tree-lined streets where we'd ridden our bikes, the park where Dad had taught us to throw a baseball, the corner store where he'd bought us ice cream after good report cards. All of it was now colored by the knowledge that our father was someone else entirely. Our house looked exactly as it always had, a modest two-story colonial with Mom's carefully tended garden blooming in the front yard. Dad's car was in the driveway, the same Honda he'd been driving for years, with a small American flag decal on the rear window that now seemed almost mockingly ironic. Mom greeted us at the door with her usual enthusiasm, immediately pulling David into a tight hug and commenting on how thin he looked. She bustled around preparing dinner while chattering about neighborhood news and asking about our jobs and Marcus's latest cases at his law firm. Dad was quieter than usual. He hugged both of us warmly, but I noticed the way his eyes lingered on the wooden box David carried, and how his smile seemed forced around the edges. During dinner, the conversation felt stilted, despite Mom's best efforts to keep things light. She talked about the wedding, about how beautiful everything had looked, about the compliments she'd received from other guests. But underneath her cheerful chatter, I could sense that she knew something was different about this visit. Finally, after we'd finished Mom's homemade apple pie, David set the wooden box on the dining room table. "Dad," he said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment, "we need to talk about what's really in here." The color drained from Dad's face. Mom looked between David and the box with growing confusion. "David, what's going on?" she asked. "What's in that box that your father gave you?" Dad closed his eyes and took a deep breath. When he opened them again, he looked older somehow, as if a weight he'd been carrying for decades was finally becoming visible. "Linda," he said to Mom, using her name in a way that immediately commanded attention, "there are things about my past that I've never told you. Things I thought I'd never have to tell you." Mom's face went pale. "William, you're scaring me." "My name," Dad said quietly, "isn't actually William Chen." The silence that followed Dad's confession was deafening. Mom's fork clattered against her dessert plate as her hand went limp. She stared at the man she'd been married to for 28 years as if seeing a stranger. "What do you mean your name isn't William Chen?" she whispered. Dad reached across the table, but Mom pulled her hands back instinctively. The gesture clearly wounded him, but he pressed on. "My real name is Park Sung-ho. I was born in Seoul in 1965, not Taiwan in 1963, like I told you when we met." Mom's breathing became shallow and rapid. "I don't understand. Why would you lie about something like that?" "About everything." Quote. Dad looked at David, then at me, as if drawing strength from our presence. "Because I was running from something, someone. And I thought if I could just disappear completely, start over with a new identity, I could build a safe life for myself and eventually for a family." "Running from what?" I demanded, my voice harsher than I'd intended. Dad stood up and walked to the window overlooking Mom's garden. With his back to us, he began speaking in a voice I'd never heard before. Quieter, more careful, tinged with an accent that was barely perceptible but definitely there. "In Korea, I worked for the government, intelligence services. I was young, ambitious, and I believed I was serving my country. But I discovered things, classified information about corruption at the highest levels, about deals being made with foreign entities that would have compromised national security. He turned back to face us, and I could see tears in his eyes. When I tried to report what I'd found through proper channels, I realized the corruption went much deeper than I'd imagined. People I trusted, people I'd worked with for years, were involved, and suddenly, I wasn't a whistleblower trying to protect my country. I was a threat that needed to be eliminated. Mom had gone completely white. Eliminated? There was an attempt on my life in 1993. I barely escaped. That's when I knew I had to disappear completely, not just leave Korea but become someone else entirely. David leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. But what does this have to do with me? How did you end up adopting a Korean child when you were trying to escape Korea? Dad's expression grew even more pained. That's the part I've regretted every day for 30 years. When I was preparing to flee the country, I was staying in a safe house, run by someone who helped people disappear. There was a young woman there, barely 20, who was pregnant and terrified. He sat back down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. Her name was Kim Mi-young. She was the daughter of a man who had been my colleague in the intelligence service, someone who had been killed because of the same corruption I'd discovered. She was alone, scared, and carrying a child she couldn't care for. The pieces were starting to come together in a horrifying way. David's birth mother, I said. Dad nodded. Mi-young died in childbirth. There were complications, and the safe house wasn't equipped for medical emergencies. Before she died, she begged me to take care of her son. She said she'd rather he grow up far away from Korea, where he'd be safe from the people who had killed her father. David's face had gone ashen. So you took me when you fled. I took you because I'd promised a dying woman I would protect you, and because... Dad's voice broke slightly. Because I'd already lost everything else that mattered to me. My career, my country, my identity. You were this innocent child who needed someone, and I needed a reason to keep going. Mom was crying now, tears streaming down her face. William, Park, whoever you are, why didn't you tell me any of this when we got married? Why did you let me believe David was your biological son? Because I was terrified, Dad admitted. By the time I met you, I'd been William Chen for 2 years. David was 5 years old and called me Dad. We'd built this life, this story, and I was so afraid that if I told the truth, I'd lose everything again. I'd lose you, I'd lose David, I'd lose the only family I'd ever really had. I felt like I was watching my entire childhood rewritten in real time. But what about me? Where do I fit into all of this deception? Dad looked at me with an expression of such profound sadness that it took my breath away. Rebecca, you were the first purely good thing that happened to me in America. When your mother told me she was pregnant, I felt like maybe I could finally have something that wasn't built on lies and running and fear. You were going to be truly mine, truly ours, born into the life we'd built together. The irony wasn't lost on me. David, who I'd always felt got more attention, more understanding from our parents, was actually the one living with the biggest lie. And I, who had sometimes felt like an outsider in my own family, was the only one who was actually born into it legitimately. The gift, I said suddenly. You were supposed to give me a gift at the wedding. That's what you texted me about. Dad reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. I was going to give you this. Your grandmother's engagement ring, the one my mother wore before she died. It's the only thing I managed to bring with me from Korea. He opened the box to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small but beautifully cut diamond surrounded by tiny emeralds. It was exquisite, clearly an antique, and obviously valuable, both monetarily and sentimentally. But when I saw David at the wedding, looking so much like his birth mother, I realized I couldn't keep carrying these secrets anymore. I knew if I gave him those documents, everything would come out. And I thought... He paused, struggling with the words. I thought maybe it was time. David was staring at the ring with a strange expression. You were going to let me find out the truth about my adoption, about your identity, about everything, just so you could give Rebecca a family heirloom? No, Dad said firmly. I was going to let you find out the truth because after 30 years of living a lie, I finally realized that the people I love deserve better than deception. even if it means losing everything I've built. Mom stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I need some air. I need to think. This is too much. She walked toward the back door, then stopped and turned around. David, honey, none of this changes how much I love you. You've been my son since you were 3 years old, and that's never going to change. David nodded, tears flowing freely now. I know, Mom. I love you too. After she stepped outside, the three of us sat in the heavy silence of 30 years of secrets finally exposed. The wooden box sat open on the table between us, its contents no longer mysterious, but somehow even more powerful now that we understood their true meaning. What happens now? I asked. Dad looked between David and me with an expression of profound uncertainty. I honestly don't know. I've been Park Sung-ho pretending to be William Chen for so long, I'm not sure who I really am anymore. The weeks following that devastating dinner were some of the most difficult our family had ever experienced. Mom moved into the guest bedroom and spoke to Dad only when absolutely necessary. David extended his stay in Chicago indefinitely, taking remote work while he processed everything he'd learned about his identity. And I found myself caught between feeling sorry for the father who had tried to protect us all, and angry at the man who had built our entire family on a foundation of lies. Marcus became my anchor during this time. He listened without judgment as I worked through the complex emotions of learning that nothing about my family was what I'd believed it to be. Some nights I'd lie awake wondering what else Dad had lied about, what other secrets might be buried in our family history. I keep thinking about all the times he told us stories about his childhood in Taiwan, I told Marcus one evening as we walked along Lake Michigan. Were any of those stories real? Did he just make them all up? Maybe some were real but transplanted, Marcus suggested. Maybe they were stories from his actual childhood in Korea, just moved to a different country to fit his new identity. The thought made me sad in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Even Dad's nostalgic stories about growing up, the ones that had helped shape my understanding of my heritage, were potentially just more elaborate deceptions. David was struggling even more intensely. He'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in adoption trauma, trying to process not just the revelation about his origins, but the emerging memories from his early childhood in Korea. The dreams he'd mentioned were becoming more frequent and vivid. I remember her voice now, he told me during one of our long talks in my living room. My birth mother. She used to sing this lullaby in Korean, and I can almost remember the words. It's like there's this whole part of me that was buried for 25 years, and now it's all coming back at once. 3 weeks after the confrontation, David made a decision that surprised all of us. He announced that he wanted to try to find his birth mother's family in Korea. I know she died, he explained to our parents during another tense family dinner. But she might have had siblings, cousins, people who knew her. I need to understand where I really came from. Dad's reaction was immediate and fearful. David, that's not safe. The people I was running from, they might still be. It's been 30 years, Dad, David interrupted, using the title that still felt natural despite everything. Whatever corruption you uncovered, whoever wanted to hurt you, they've probably moved on. And I need to do this for myself. Mom, who had been slowly warming back up to Dad over the past few weeks, spoke up. If David wants to explore his heritage, we should support him. He has a right to know about his birth family. I could see the internal battle playing out on Dad's face. His protective instincts were warring with his guilt over keeping David from his roots for so long. If you're determined to do this, Dad said finally, then I'm going with you. I know the language, I know the culture, and I know what dangers to watch for. David looked surprised. You'd really go back to Korea? After everything you went through to escape? You're my son, Dad said simply, not by blood, but in every way that matters. If you need to do this, then we'll do it together. It was the first time since the revelation that I'd seen something resembling the father I'd grown up with. Despite all his lies and deception, his love for David was clearly genuine. The trip was planned for the following month. Dad would need to apply for a visa under his real name, Park Sung-ho, which required him to officially acknowledge his Korean citizenship for the first time in 3 decades. The process was complicated and nerve-wracking, but somehow his old passport was still valid. And the Korean consulate in Chicago processed his application without any red flags. While they prepared for their journey, I found myself dealing with my own identity crisis. Learning that my father was Korean, not Chinese as I'd always believed, meant re-examining my entire understanding of my heritage. The last name Chen, which I had worn with pride my whole life, was just another part of his constructed identity. I don't know who I am anymore, I confided to Mom during one of our coffee dates. She'd started inviting me for regular one-on-one time, as if she needed to rebuild her relationships with each of us individually. You're still Rebecca, she said firmly. You're still my daughter. You're still Marcus's wife. You're still the same person with the same values and dreams and talents. Your father's deception doesn't change who you are. But it changes where I come from. It changes the stories I tell about myself, about our family. Mom reached across the table and took my hand. Sweetheart, I've been thinking about this a lot over the past month. Your father made some terrible choices in how he handled his past. But the family we built together, the love we shared, the memories we made, those things were real. The man who taught you to ride a bike and helped you with homework and walked you down the aisle at your wedding, that man was real, even if his name and background were fabricated. Her words helped, but I still felt unmoored. I'd spent my whole life as Rebecca Chen, the daughter of a Taiwanese immigrant and a woman from Illinois. Now I was Rebecca Chen, the daughter of a Korean spy, and a woman who'd been unknowingly married to a man living under an assumed identity. The day before David and Dad were scheduled to leave for Seoul, our family gathered for what felt like a farewell dinner. Mom had cooked an elaborate meal, and for the first time in weeks, the atmosphere felt almost normal. I have something for you, Dad said to David as we finished dessert. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope. I wrote down everything I can remember about your birth mother. Her full name, the neighborhood where she grew up, the names of her friends that she mentioned. It's not much, but it might help you find her family. David accepted the envelope with shaking hands. Thank you for this and for agreeing to come with me. Dad nodded, then turned to me. Rebecca, I know I can't undo the lies I've told or the deception I've built our family on, but I want you to know that every story I told you about loving you, about being proud of you, about wanting the best for you, those were completely true. I felt tears starting again. Despite everything, despite the anger and confusion and betrayal, he was still my father. The man who had raised me, supported me, celebrated my achievements, and comforted me through disappointments. I know, Dad, I said quietly. I'm still hurt, and I'm still angry, but I know you love me. He reached into his pocket one more time and pulled out the velvet ring box from my wedding night. I never did give you your gift properly. This time, when he opened the box, I could see the ring clearly in the good light of the dining room. It was even more beautiful than I'd remembered, delicate and timeless and obviously precious. This belonged to my mother, Park Yun-young, Dad said, using his birth mother's real name for the first time. She died when I was 15, but she always told me this ring should go to my daughter someday. You're the only daughter I've ever had, Rebecca. Whatever name I was using when you were born, you're still the most important thing I've ever helped create. As he slipped the ring onto my right hand, I realized that this moment, this honest, painful, complicated moment, was worth more than any wedding gift could have been. It was the first completely truthful thing my father had given me in my adult life. David and Dad returned from Seoul 3 weeks later, but they were both different people than the ones who had left. David carried himself with a new sense of completeness, while Dad seemed somehow lighter, as if a burden he'd carried for decades had finally been lifted. They'd found her. David's birth mother's family had not only survived, but had been searching for any information about Kim Mi-young's son for 30 years. Her older sister, Kim Soo-jin, had never stopped hoping that somehow her nephew had survived and was living somewhere in the world. She looks just like Mom, David told me, using Mom to refer to his birth mother for the first time. He showed me photographs on his phone of a woman in her 60s with David's eyes and gentle smile. Aunt Soo-jin said Mi-young used to talk about wanting to study literature, about dreams of becoming a writer. She kept a journal that Soo-jin saved all these years. The reunion had been emotional beyond anything David had prepared for. Soo-jin had brought David's birth mother's journal, along with photographs from her childhood and letters she'd written to friends. For the first time in his life, David was able to see where his academic drive and love of reading had come from, traits that had never quite fit with what we'd believed was his Chinese heritage. The most incredible part, David continued, was learning that M.I. Young's father, my birth grandfather, had been working to expose the same corruption that Dad discovered. They were essentially on the same side, fighting the same fight. Dad thinks that's why M.I. Young trusted him with me, because she knew he understood what her father had died for. Dad had his own revelations from the trip. The political landscape in Korea had changed dramatically since his exile. Many of the people he'd been running from were dead, retired, or had themselves been exposed and prosecuted for corruption. The democratic reforms of the past 3 decades had made South Korea a very different country than the one he'd fled. I spent 30 years looking over my shoulder, Dad told us during a family dinner shortly after their return. 30 years afraid that someone would find us, hurt our family, destroy the life we'd built. But those threats, they haven't existed for probably 20 years. Mom, who had been gradually working through her feelings about Dad's deception with the help of a marriage counselor, asked the question we were all thinking. So what happens now? Do you want to go back to being Park Sung-ho? Dad considered this for a long moment. I've been William Chen longer than I ever was Park Sung-ho. This identity isn't just a disguise anymore, it's who I became. But I want to stop hiding from the other part of myself. Over the following months, our family began the complex process of integrating Dad's dual identity into our lives. He started teaching David and me basic Korean, sharing real stories from his childhood in Seoul instead of the fabricated tales about Taiwan. We learned about Korean holidays and traditions that were actually part of our heritage. David made the decision to legally add his birth name to his official documents, becoming David Kim Chen. He said it felt like honoring both parts of his history, the family that gave him life and the family that raised him. For me, the adjustment was more subtle but equally significant. I started exploring Korean culture, trying foods I'd never tasted, learning about historical events that had shaped my father's early life. It was strange to discover that kimchi and bulgogi felt somehow familiar, as if some genetic memory was awakening. The most surprising development came 6 months after Dad and David's trip to Korea. Aunt Sujin reached out through David to ask if she could visit America. She wanted to meet the family that had raised her nephew and to see the life M.I. Young's son had built. Her visit that Christmas was extraordinary. Despite the language barrier, she spoke very little English, and our Korean was still elementary. The connection was immediate and powerful. She brought gifts for all of us, including a beautiful hanbok for me and traditional Korean items for Mom and Marcus. But her most precious gift was a letter that M.I. Young had written to David when she was pregnant with him. Sujin had saved it for 30 years, hoping someday to give it to her nephew. Dad translated the letter for us, his voice breaking several times as he read M.I. Young's words about her hopes for her unborn son, her fears about not being able to raise him herself, and her prayer that he would grow up strong and happy and loved. She says she chose the name Ji-hoon because it means bright wisdom, Dad translated, tears streaming down his face. She wanted you to be someone who could see the truth clearly and help others understand it too. David wept as he listened to his birth mother's words, finally understanding the woman who had given him life and the sacrifice she'd made to try to give him a better future. As I watched my family, this complicated, wounded, healing family, gathered around our Christmas tree, I realized that the gift Dad had tried to give me at my wedding had turned out to be something far more valuable than a ring or any physical object. The real gift was the truth. Painful, complicated, devastating truth that had torn apart our understanding of ourselves, but ultimately allowed us to build something more honest and authentic. My wedding day had felt like the beginning of my new life with Marcus, but that moment when Dad gave the wooden box to David instead of my expected gift, that had actually been the beginning of our family's new life together. A life built on honesty instead of necessity, on choice instead of circumstance, on love that could survive even the deepest deceptions. The ring, my grandmother Park Yoon-young's ring, sits on my dresser now, catching the morning light. I wear it sometimes, especially on days when I want to remember that identity is more complex than names or birthplaces, or the stories we tell ourselves about where we come from. I'm still Rebecca Chen, but now I know that name carries the weight of multiple histories, multiple cultures, multiple families, who have loved and lost and fought to protect the people they cared about. Dad's gift to David exposed all of our secrets, but in doing so, it gave us something more precious than any family heirloom. It gave us the chance to choose each other again, this time with our eyes wide open. Sometimes the most meaningful gifts are the ones we never expected to receive. 2 years had passed since that Christmas when Aunt Sujin visited us, and our family had settled into what I could only describe as a new normal. But just as I thought we'd finally found our equilibrium, life threw us another curveball that would test everything we'd learned about love, identity, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in March. I was at my design studio, working on a rebranding project for a local restaurant, when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Normally, I'd let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Hello, is this Rebecca Chen?" The voice was unfamiliar, professional but warm. "Yes, this is Rebecca. My name is Dr. Jennifer Walsh. I am a genealogist and family researcher. I've been working with your brother David on some family history research, and he suggested I reach out to you directly." Quote, my stomach immediately tensed. David hadn't mentioned hiring a genealogist, and after everything our family had been through, the idea of digging deeper into our past felt both thrilling and terrifying. "What kind of research?" I asked carefully. "Well, it's quite fascinating, actually. David contacted me about 6 months ago because he wanted to learn more about his birth mother's family lineage. But in the process of that research, I discovered some information about your father's family that I think you should know about." I set down my stylus and gave her my full attention. "What kind of information?" "The Park family has a much more complex history than your father probably realizes. I've been able to trace back several generations, and there are some remarkable stories there. But more immediately relevant, I've discovered that your father has living relatives in Korea that he's never been in contact with." My heart started racing. "What do you mean, living relatives?" "Your father had a younger sister, Park It-kyung, who was only 8 years old when he fled Korea. She's still alive, Rebecca. She's been living in Busan her entire life, and she's been searching for her brother for over 30 years. The room felt like it was spinning. Dad had never mentioned having a sister. In all his stories, real or fabricated, he'd always described himself as an only child whose parents had died young. Yet another fundamental piece of our family story was apparently a lie. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. After everything we'd been through, I'd learned to expect that there were always more secrets waiting to be uncovered. "I have documentation going back to the 1940s, including birth certificates and school records. Park Mi-kyung is definitely your father's sister. She married a man named Lee Jae-min in 1985 and has 3 children, which means you and David have cousins in Korea you've never met." After I hung up with Dr. Walsh, I sat in my studio for nearly an hour, trying to process this new information. Part of me was excited about the possibility of more family, more connections to our Korean heritage. But another part of me was frustrated and hurt that Dad had apparently lied about yet another aspect of his past. I called David first, needing to understand why he'd hired a genealogist without telling the family. "I was going to tell everyone once I had more complete information," he explained. "After meeting Aunt Sujin and learning so much about my birth mother's family, I got curious about Dad's family too. I thought maybe there were relatives he'd lost touch with, people who might want to know he was safe and had built a good life in America." "Did you expect to find a sister he'd never mentioned?" David was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, at this point I've learned not to expect anything when it comes to Dad's past. But Rebecca, Dr. Walsh has photographs. Park Mi-kyung looks exactly like Dad did at her age. There's no question they're siblings." That evening, Marcus and I drove to my parents' house. David had flown in from Seattle again. These family crisis meetings were becoming a regular occurrence, and we'd agreed that we needed to confront Dad together. Mom answered the door looking tired. The past 2 years had aged her, and while she and Dad had worked through most of their marital issues in counseling, the constant revelations about his past had taken their toll. He's in his study, she said simply. He's been expecting this conversation since David called this morning. We found Dad sitting at his desk, staring at an old photograph I'd never seen before. As we entered the room, he looked up with an expression of resignation mixed with something that might have been relief. "You found Mi Kyung," he said. It wasn't a question. "Why didn't you tell us you had a sister?" I asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "After everything we've been through, after all the promises about no more lies, how could you keep this from us?" Dad set down the photograph and gestured for us to sit. The picture I could see now showed 2 children, a boy of maybe 10, and a much younger girl with pigtails and a bright smile. "Because I thought she was dead," Dad said quietly. "When I fled Korea, Mi Kyung was just 8 years old. Our parents had already died, and she was living with our elderly grandmother. I tried to send money back, tried to arrange for her care, but the people helping me disappear said it was too dangerous to maintain any contact with Korea." He picked up the photograph again, his fingers tracing the little girl's face. "I received word through intermediaries that our grandmother had died in 1995, just a year after I left. I assumed Mi Kyung had been placed in an orphanage, and in those days, the likelihood of an 8-year-old girl being adopted was..." He shrugged sadly. "I thought the kindest thing I could do was let her go, not spend her whole life searching for a brother who could never safely return." David leaned forward. "But she wasn't placed in an orphanage. According to Dr. Walsh's research, she was taken in by a family friend, someone who knew your parents. She was raised well, educated, and she's been successful in her own right. And she's been looking for you," I added. "For 30 years, Dad. She never gave up hope that you were alive somewhere." Dad's composure finally cracked, and he began to cry with a raw intensity I'd never seen from him before. "I abandoned her. I left my baby sister behind, and I convinced myself it was for her own good. But really, I was just too scared, too selfish to figure out a way to bring her with me or even to let her know I was safe." Mom, who had been standing quietly in the doorway, came into the room and put her hand on Dad's shoulder. "William, you were 28 years old and running for your life. You made the best decision you could with the information you had." "But I had choices," Dad said through his tears. "Over the years, as I became more established here, as the threat from Korea diminished, I could have tried to find her. I could have reached out. Instead, I built this perfect American life and pretended my past didn't exist." The conversation that followed was one of the most emotionally intense our family had ever had. Dad told us about his guilt over leaving Mi Kyung, about the nightmares he'd had for years imagining what might have happened to her. He talked about how adopting David had been partially motivated by his guilt over abandoning his sister, as if raising one Korean child could somehow make up for failing to protect another. "Every time I looked at David when he was young," Dad admitted, "I saw Mi Kyung at that age. It's part of why I was so protective of him, so determined to give him every opportunity. I was trying to give him the life I wished I could have given her." David absorbed this information with the same grace he'd shown throughout all our family revelations. "So in a way, you were honoring her memory even when you thought she was gone." Dad nodded. "But that doesn't excuse the fact that I gave up on her, that I chose my own safety and comfort over finding out what happened to my sister." Over the next few weeks, with Dr. Walsh's help, we arranged for Dad to make contact with Mi Kyung through a Korean community organization in Busan. The first phone call happened on a Sunday morning, with David and me present to provide emotional support. Dad had written out what he wanted to say in Korean, practicing the words he hadn't spoken to family in over 30 years. When the call connected and he heard his sister's voice for the first time since 1994, he immediately began sobbing so hard he couldn't speak. Mi Kyung, according to the translator who was helping facilitate the call, was crying just as hard. She told him she'd never stopped believing he was alive somewhere, that she'd kept the same phone number for 20 years, just in case he ever tried to call. The conversation was awkward and emotional and beautiful. Mi Kyung told Dad about her life, her marriage, her 3 children, her career as a high school mathematics teacher. She told him she'd named her oldest son Sung Ho after him, hoping that somehow it would bring her brother back to her. Dad told her about his life in America, about Mom and David and me, about the family he'd built while never forgetting the family he'd left behind. He apologized over and over for abandoning her, for not trying harder to find her, for letting her think she was alone in the world. "She wants to meet all of us," Dad said after the call ended. "She wants to come to America this summer and meet her American family." The prospect of another family member visiting, of further expanding our already complex family dynamics, was both exciting and overwhelming. But David immediately began making plans, offering to help coordinate her visit and serve as a cultural bridge between Emikyung and the rest of us. "There is something else," Dad said as we were preparing to leave that day. "Emikyung told me that our parents had left some family heirlooms with their friend when they died. Things that were supposed to be divided between Emikyung and me when we were older. She's been keeping my share safe for 30 years. I thought about the ring I wore sometimes, my grandmother Park Yoon-young's ring, and realized it was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of family heritage Dad had never been able to claim." "What kind of heirlooms?" Mom asked. "Traditional Korean furniture, some of our grandfather's calligraphy, our mother's jewelry collection, photographs dating back to the early 1900s. An entire family history that I thought was lost forever." Quote, "As we drove home that evening, I reflected on how that wooden box David had received at my wedding had been like opening Pandora's box. But instead of releasing evils into the world, it had released truth. Complicated, painful, beautiful truth that kept expanding our understanding of who we were and where we came from." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Dad had just given you that ring at the wedding like he planned?" Marcus asked as we pulled into our driveway. I considered the question seriously. We might have gone our whole lives not knowing the truth about David's adoption, about Dad's real identity, about Emikyung. We might have been happy, but it would have been happiness built on lies. And now? I looked at the ring on my finger, thinking about all the family members I'd never known existed, all the stories that were still waiting to be discovered. Now we're building something real. It's messier and more complicated than what we had before, but it's honest. And I think that's worth more than any perfect fairy tale could ever be. As we walked into our house, I realized that Dad's impulsive decision to give David that box of secrets instead of giving me a simple wedding gift had set in motion a chain of revelations that was still unfolding. Emikyung's visit this summer would bring new stories, new connections, new complications to navigate. But for the first time since that night at my wedding reception, I felt ready for whatever surprises our family might still be hiding. We'd learned how to handle the truth, no matter how difficult, and we'd learned that love, real love, is strong enough to survive even the biggest secrets. The gift Dad had meant to give me was a ring. The gift he actually gave me was something far more valuable. A family that chose honesty over comfort, truth over convenience, and each other over everything else. Some gifts, I'd learned, are worth waiting your whole life to receive. Emikyung's arrival at O'Hare Airport in July felt like the culmination of a journey that had started 3 years earlier with a wooden box and a shattered expectation. David and I stood beside Dad as passengers streamed through the international arrivals gate, watching him fidget with nervous energy I'd never seen before. When she emerged from customs, there was no question about their relationship. Emikyung was unmistakably Dad's sister. The same angular jawline, the same thoughtful eyes, even the same way of tilting her head when concentrating. But where Dad carried the weight of decades of secrets, she radiated an openness that immediately put everyone at ease. Their reunion was pure emotion. Dad rushed forward and embraced his sister for the first time in 30 years, both of them sobbing in the middle of the busy airport. She was smaller than I'd expected, barely reaching Dad's shoulder, but there was a strength in her presence that filled the space around her. Through David's translation, his Korean had improved dramatically over the past 2 years. Emikyung told us she'd brought 2 suitcases. One contained her clothes and gifts for us. The other was filled entirely with family artifacts she'd been safeguarding. Back at our parents' house, Emikyung unpacked treasures that transformed our understanding of our heritage. There were hand-painted silk scrolls featuring traditional Korean landscapes, carved wooden figurines that had belonged to our great-grandfather, and dozens of photographs dating back to the 1920s. But the most significant item was a leather-bound journal that had belonged to our grandfather, Park Yoon-sik. Kyung explained that he'd been a teacher and poet who had documented family stories and traditions, wanting to preserve them for future generations. He wrote this specifically for his grandchildren, she said through David's translation, her eyes bright with tears. He wanted you and any children you might have to know where they came from. As Dad carefully turned the pages of his father's handwriting, I watched his expression shift from wonder to profound sadness. I thought I'd lost all of this forever, he whispered. I thought I'd cut myself off from our history completely. Kyung reached across the table and took his hand. Through David, she said, You didn't lose anything, Appa. You were protecting it. Everything you built here, this family you created, these children you raised. This is also our grandfather's legacy. Over the following weeks, Kyung shared stories that filled in gaps we hadn't even known existed. She told us about family traditions we could now reclaim, about relatives who had wondered about Dad's fate, about a culture that was as much ours as the American identity we'd grown up with. The most meaningful moment came when she presented me with a small silk pouch that had belonged to our grandmother. Inside was a delicate jade bracelet, traditional Korean jewelry that was meant to be passed down through generations of women. This was your grandmother's, Kyung explained. She always said it should go to the first granddaughter. She would have been so proud to know Sung-ho had a daughter. As she fastened the bracelet around my wrist, I felt a connection to generations of women I'd never known, but whose strength and resilience had somehow found their way to me. The jade was warm against my skin, as if it had been waiting decades to find its rightful place. Kyung's visit also brought unexpected healing for David. She shared memories of their father that no one else could have provided, stories about the man who had tried to expose corruption and died for his principles. Your birth mother spoke about him often, Kyung told David. She said he was the most honest person she'd ever known, someone who couldn't live with injustice. That's why she trusted Sung-ho with you, because she saw that same integrity in him. On Kyung's last evening with us, our entire extended family gathered for a traditional Korean meal she had taught Mom to prepare. The table was filled with dishes whose names I was still learning to pronounce, flavors that somehow felt familiar despite being new to my palate. Dad stood up during dinner, holding his glass high. 3 years ago, I thought I was giving David some old documents. I had no idea I was actually giving our entire family the chance to discover who we really are. He looked around the table at all of us, Mom, Marcus, David, Kyung, and me. I spent 30 years running from my past, thinking I could create a perfect American life by forgetting where I came from. But I learned that the most meaningful gift we can give each other isn't perfection. It's truth, even when it's complicated. Kyung raised her glass, speaking in Korean before David translated. She says that in Korean culture, we believe that families are connected across time and distance by invisible threads. Those threads can be stretched, but they can never be broken. Our family's threads were stretched for 30 years, but they brought us back together when we were ready. As we prepared to take Kyung to the airport the next morning, she pulled me aside for a private conversation. Through David's translation, she told me something I'll never forget. She says that in our grandfather's journal, he wrote about hoping his future granddaughters would be strong enough to bridge different worlds, David translated. He wrote that the women in our family would be the ones to heal whatever breaks occurred across generations. I looked down at the jade bracelet on my wrist, thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. A wedding gift that never got given had somehow led to the discovery of an entire family we didn't know existed. Tell her, I said to David, that I understand now. The gift Dad was supposed to give me that night was just a ring. But what he actually gave me was so much more valuable. David translated, and Kyung smiled, reaching out to touch the jade bracelet gently. She says our grandmother would have said that the best gifts are the ones that keep giving, long after they've been received. As we drove home from the airport, I reflected on how dramatically our family had changed since my wedding day. We'd gone from a simple American family with a straightforward immigrant story to a complex, multicultural network of relationships spanning 2 continents and multiple generations. The wooden box that had started it all sat on my mantel now, empty but somehow still significant. It reminded me that sometimes the most important moments in our lives come disguised as disappointments, that the gifts we think we want are rarely the gifts we actually need. My father had tried to give me a ring at my wedding. Instead, he gave me a truth that transformed everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the courage it takes to choose each other again and again, no matter what secrets the past might hold. 3 years later, I finally understood that it was the most perfect wedding gift I could have ever received. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.